Do you love beer? Do you love board games? Do you love Uwe Rosenberg? Well, if you answered yes to any of these questions, you'll be pleased to know that the newest Uwe Rosenberg game is now out in the wild, and with it comes all the usual joys of Uwe Rosenberg games. Collecting goods, breeding animals, convincing your friends that a game about collecting goods and breeding animals is actually fun. It's Hallertau. It's a game where you kind of collect these. We can play Wingspan. Today I'm going to teach you how to play Hallertau so that you can get it to the table just a little bit quicker. Now this is the newest big box game from Uwe Rosenberg, and it does its best to intimidate you by putting expert level in big letters right on the bottom of the box, but in actuality it's not that complicated of a game. There's just some systems to get your head around, but after that it goes pretty quick. So just to prove that fact, I thought it would be extra fun for me to do this entire how to play completely inebriated on beer. And after 30 minutes of recording footage and realizing I didn't even hit the record button, I wept for a couple hours in the shower, and here we are doing it again. So let me teach you how to play Hallertau. To set up the main playing area, place the large action board in the center of the table. Next, pull out the 4 gateway decks and the 4 farmyard decks. You can differentiate the 4 gateway decks as well as the 4 farmyard decks by the subtle differences on the back of the cards. You can think of it as a bonus spot the difference puzzle that's included right in the box. Pick 1 gateway deck and 1 farmyard deck. The other decks are returned to the box. Now also grab the bonus deck of cards and the points deck of cards. They're the ones with these backs. Shuffle each of these decks and place them on their designated spots on the board. If you're playing with 1 to 3 players, shuffle the quadrant cards and place them in a stack next to the board. If you're playing with 4, you won't use this deck. Next, if you're playing with 1 to 3 players, draw a quadrant card and look at the section of it for your player count. Place 1 worker cube on the bottom row of each quadrant that is not listed on your appropriate section of the quadrant card. For reference, there are 4 quadrants on the board. So if I drew this card, I would only place worker cubes on the bottom row of these quadrants. Anytime a quadrant card shows a question mark between quadrants on your player count section, it means to pick a random quadrant from the ones listed, using a coin, dice, or any other method. If you are playing with 4 players, you can skip this last section completely and simply place no workers on the board to start the game. Lastly, place the fields, goods, sheep, tools, and workers near the board in a general supply. Now let's set up the player areas. For each player, take a community board and place the community center on top of it, flush with the left side of the board so that the number 6 is showing through the window. Place the 5 unique craft buildings next to the community center on your board. You can place these in any order, but the rulebook suggests you use this order. Next, place 2 boulders on each row next to the craft buildings. The first column of boulders is placed 2 spaces away, and the next column of boulders is placed 2 spaces away from the previous boulders. Place a field board in front of each player. Take 3 fields and place them on the board on the spots with this little square on the corner. Place 1 barley, 1 flax, and 1 rye on row 1 of the field board. Take a stable board. Draw 6 farmyard cards and don't look at them. Place 1 face down on each of the 6 stable spots. Take a jewelry tile box and place the jewelry token on the 0 spot. And finally, take 4 gateway cards and 1 point card to form your personal hand of cards. Now you're set up and ready to play. Normally I would start by going over the sequence of a turn, but with Hallertau, I think there's a few concepts that'll help if you know about beforehand, just to help with your understanding of everything. So let's jump right into those concepts. First, let's talk about worker placement. This is a worker placement game, and the action board consists of 20 spots you can place workers. Spots can be used multiple times, but cost increasingly more. You will always place a worker or workers on the bottom-most open spot. So if I wanted to use this space, it would currently cost me 1 worker. If I wanted to use this space, it would cost me 3. If all 3 spots are filled, you cannot use that action. Every player begins the game with 6 workers indicated by the number in your community center window. But as your community center moves along your board, you will have more workers at your disposal up to a maximum of 12. To move the community center, you will first have to move the 5 craft buildings as they are in the way. When all 5 craft buildings have moved at least 1 column over, the community center will automatically move 1 spot to the right as well. The community center only moves when the last craft building moves to free up a column. To move the craft buildings, you will be spending resources from your personal supply. The resources needed to move each craft building are listed on the building itself. For instance, the manufacturer requires flax, hides, or wool. Alternatively, you can spend a single jewelry to move a craft building one space without spending any resources. If a craft building is ever next to a boulder, you must spend the necessary resources and use one tool to move the boulder one space to the right with the building. The difference is that the goods are spent and discarded, but the tool is just used and not discarded. Sheep are an important part of Hallertau. There's even an entire board dedicated to them, the stable board. Whenever you acquire a sheep, look at your current round and place the sheep on the stable section that is beneath your round. So if it's round 1, you would place the acquired sheep on the space beneath round 1, which is round 4. If you are in round 4, 5, or 6 and acquire a sheep, place a sheep directly into the stables at the bottom. Cards can be played at any time in Hallertau. It doesn't matter if it's your turn, your opponent's turn, anytime you can play a card, no restrictions. Some cards will show a condition on a notebook page at the top and then a reward on the bottom. When you see this doesn't mean you actually have to spend what's on the top of the card. Rather, you just have to have it in your supply and you can then play the card whenever you would like. For instance, for this card, as soon as I own 3 sheep on my stable board, I can play this card to gain 1 clay and sow 1 crop onto a field. I don't have to spend the 3 sheep. Other cards will specifically have this orange arrow beneath the top condition. This means you do have to spend the resource. So for instance, on this card, I would have to spend 1 sheep in order to gain 2 clay and 2 tools. Note that some cards have an additional card draw bonus in the bottom right. You also get to draw the cards listed for fulfilling the card condition. So on this card, I would also draw 1 bonus card indicated by the market stall icon. Some cards stay in play and earn you income every round. They are indicated by this brown bar that has a silver 3 surrounded by a round arrow. This card, for instance, would cost 3 hops to play and then it would stay in my play area. Every round on phase 3, I would gain 1 tool for the rest of the game as income. There are also some cards that have restrictions on which phase they can or cannot be played in. This will be indicated by a brown bar like this. This means you can only play it in phase 4. And this means you can play it in any phase except phase 8. Lastly, the deck of point cards all reward you with points for meeting the condition. They will generally all require you to spend resources as indicated by the orange arrow. Good quantities are tracked a little differently in Hallertau. If you gain 4 clay, for instance, you don't actually take 4 wooden clay pieces into your supply. Instead, you place a single clay piece on the 4 spot on your field board. This indicates that you have 4 of that resource. If you ever acquire more than 5 of a good, simply take another piece and place it on the field board so that the 2 pieces together add up to your total. For instance, if I already had 5 clay and I gained 3 more, I would leave my first clay piece on the 5 spot and place another clay piece on the 3 spot for a total of 8 clay. You are free to rearrange these however you'd like though. So for instance, if I preferred to have both clay pieces on the 4 spot, it would still add up to 8 and would be completely allowed. The last concept to know about is your crops. You will have empty fields on your field board that you can place crops onto in order to quickly increase the amounts of each crop you have. Whenever you sow crops, you will choose a crop and place 1 from your personal supply onto an empty field. Note that this means if you had 5 flax and wanted to sow 1 onto an empty field, you would reduce your flax to 4 to indicate you are spending 1, and then take a new flax piece from the general supply and place it onto the empty field. However, if you only had 1 of that good, for instance, if I only had 1 rye in my supply and wanted to sow it onto a field, I could simply take that piece from the 1 spot and place it onto the field, as my supply would have been reduced to 0 anyways, and I would have been discarding that rye piece. It's important to remember that you only ever take 1 of the good to sow onto a field. So if you have more than 1 of that good, don't just remove the good indicator from your field board and place it onto the field, as you'll be giving up more than you should. Okay, so those are all the concepts I wanted to go over before we jumped into things, so now it's time to talk about the sequence of a round in Hallertau. Now there are 6 rounds in the game, and each round consists of 10 phases. We're going to start with phase 1, but note that in the first round of the game, you'll actually skip phase 1, but for all subsequent rounds, you'll play phase 1 as normal. In phase 1, you remove workers from the board. In a 4-player game, simply remove the topmost row of every single spot on the board. In a 1 to 3 player game, instead draw a quadrant card and only remove workers from the topmost row of the quadrants listed under your specific player section on the card. For all other quadrants, you don't remove any workers. In phase 2, you acquire new workers for the round. First, take the farmyard card from your stable board that's on top of the current round and move it off of the board, keeping it face down. If any sheep were on top of this card, those sheep die off and are returned to the general supply. This will generally only become a factor from round 4 onwards. Next, look at the number in your community center window and add that many worker cubes from the supply on top of this face down farmyard card. This will be your supply of workers for the round. Phase 3 is income. Now, you're going to actually skip this phase on the first round of the game as well, because no one's going to have any income cards in front of themselves yet. But on all subsequent rounds, any players who have income cards in front of themselves in their player area, they're just going to gain whatever is listed on the income card. Okay, so phase 4. Now, this is probably the biggest phase of the entire game. This is where all the actions take place. All players are going to alternate taking one action by placing a worker cube or worker cubes onto the main board and selecting that action and carrying it out. You cannot pass. You have to actually use all your cubes. If you don't want to take an action, you can alternatively change one worker cube for a tool 1-to-1, and you can do that as many times as you want as one action. So I could exchange one worker cube for one tool, or I could exchange 3 worker cubes for 3 tools, and that would be considered one action. When you take an action, you will always place workers on the bottommost empty spot of the action you are taking, meaning you will either be spending 1, 2, or 3 workers to take an action, depending which is the lowest spot available. You can choose to use the same action again on a subsequent turn as long as there's still a spot available to place workers on. Here are the type of actions you'll encounter. Anything with a plus sign before it means you simply gain those resources for taking the action. For instance, on this spot, you gain 1 sheep and 1 meat. Keep in mind what we talked about with resources before. If this is your first meat, you would simply take a wooden meat token and place it on the 1 spot of your field board. If you already had some meat, for example 2, you would simply slide this existing meat token up 1 spot to 3. And remember, sheep are added to the stable spot, which is below the current round number. Some action spots are exchange actions, which will be indicated by the orange arrow. Going to one of these spots means you'll exchange a resource to gain other ones. For instance, this action means you will remove 1 field from your field board and in turn gain 1 jewelry and 3 clay. Some action spots give you sow actions, indicated by this icon. These are featured on the 4 spots in the middle of the board. For each sow action, you may move 1 crop from your supply onto an empty field. Remember what we talked about earlier. If you have, let's say, 4 of a crop and wish to sow it, don't simply remove the wooden token from the 4 and put it onto the field. You only need to use 1 of that crop. So in this case, you would slide the crop down from 4 to 3 to indicate that you've spent 1 of that crop, and then take a new indicator token from the supply and add it to the empty field. Some actions will tell you that your sheep gains +1 round. What this means is that you're essentially extending the life of your sheep. To do this, move a single sheep token to the right on your stable board 1 card over. If the sheep token you were moving was already on the round 6 spot, simply move it down to the safety of the stables. There are 4 card action spots on the board that allow you to draw a card from that quadrant's respective deck. In addition, they also give you the first player marker. Keep in mind there are 4 of these spots that award the first player marker, so the first player marker can actually move around multiple times in a round. Whoever has it last will be the first player on the next round of the game. Now, the last thing to note is that all of these action spaces you can go to and not actually carry out the action. So if you wanted to just block it from a player or only want to do part of the action that's on there, you can totally do that. If you want to just go somewhere, do nothing with the spot just to block from someone and just be a jerk, you are absolutely entitled to do it. Okay, on to phase 5. For phase 5, you simply take the farmyard card that had all your workers on it and add it to your hand now. Phase 6 is fallow fields. In this phase, all empty fields on your board slide 1 spot in their column upwards, making them more efficient at producing crops. Then, slide exactly 1 empty field an additional spot up in its column. Phase 7 is harvesting. In this phase, any fields you sowed crops onto will produce their additional crops. 1 by 1, move each crop that is planted on a field off of that field and to the left onto the numbered spot on your field board. For instance, this rye would move off of the field and onto the 4 spot, meaning I've gained 4 rye. Then move the newly empty field 1 spot down on its column, decreasing its efficiency. Do this for every field that has a planted crop on it. Phase 8 is milking. Simply count up all the sheep on your stable board and gain 1 milk for each sheep you have. So phase 9 is progress. Now this is the other big phase in a round where you're going to be spending most of your time. In this phase, you're going to spend all your hard-earned goods and resources to actually move the craft buildings to the right, a number of spaces depending on how many you choose to spend and how many you've collected. As I mentioned earlier, each craft building has certain resources that can be spent to move them. And the other thing you have to consider is that in each round, you're going to be needing to spend a different number of resources to move a craft building. So for instance, in round 1, you only need to spend a single resource to move a building 1 spot to the right. In round 2, you'd have to spend 2 resources to move it. In round 3, you'd have to spend 3 resources and so on. So it gets increasingly more expensive to move the buildings towards the right. So for instance, to move the cooling house in round 1, I would only have to spend 1 single good, and I can choose between milk and meat, as those are the goods listed on the cooling house. In round 2, however, I would need to spend 2 goods to move it. I could spend 1 milk and 1 meat, or 2 of either good. 3 of the craft buildings have special constraints when it comes to spending goods on them. Let's go over each one. To move the carpentry building, you must pay more clay than rye. This means that it's not actually possible to use rye to move the carpentry building until round 3. In the first 2 rounds, you would only be able to use clay to move it because you always have to spend more clay than rye. Likewise, to move the brew house, you need to spend more barley than hops per advancement. Finally, to move the bake house, you can pay at most 1 flax per advancement. You can spend as much barley and rye as you'd like per advancement, but you can only ever spend 1 flax to move it once. Keep in mind that you can move each craft building as many times as you want each round as long as you have the resources to spend on it. And likewise, remember that instead of paying the resources listed on a building, you can instead pay a single jewelry to forego the cost and move it once to the right. If at any point all craft buildings are at least 1 space away from the community center slides to the right as well. Another thing to know is that in round 3 onwards, you can get a discount on advancing the craft buildings. These discounts are listed on the stable board and all have to do with spending a certain amount of unique different goods. For instance, in round 3 and 4, if you spend 2 different goods rather than using all the same type, you will receive a discount of 1 good to the cost of moving a craft building. Likewise, in round 5 and 6, you can also receive a 2 good discount if you spend 3 unique types of goods on an advancement. As I mentioned earlier, if a craft building is ever next to a boulder and you wish to move it, you must use a tool from your supply to move the boulder along with paying the cost to move the craft building. The boulder will move 1 spot to the right. If the building is ever next to 2 boulders, you must spend 2 tools in order to move both boulders. Once you push a boulder off the end of the board, you can leave it there and it doesn't need to be moved anymore to the right. Although I mentioned that tools are used and not actually discarded when you move boulders, in round 6, this rule changes. In the 6th round, every tool you use is actually discarded back to the general supply. The 10th and final phase is the boulder phase. In this phase, simply reset all the boulders so that the first boulder is 2 spaces away from the craft building on that row, and the second boulder is 4 spaces away. As you move buildings, this means that rows can have boulders at different distances away, depending on which buildings have progressed further. Since there is an action on the board that actually moves craft buildings to the left, this means you might also have to move boulders back to the left as well. They just always have to be 2 and 4 spaces away from the craft building on their row at the end of this phase. And that's an entire round of Hallertau. After the phase 10, you'll simply go back to phase 1, do it all again, and after 6 rounds of this, the game's over. Whoever has the most points will win. The main way you're going to score points is via the community center board. First, tally up any points that are showing in the community center window. Then add on points for every 3 victory point symbol that is to the left of a craft building and is showing on your board. You'll also score 1 victory point for every sheep in your supply. Likewise, you'll also score 1 victory point for every jewelry remaining in your jewelry box. Total up all your goods and tools and you will score 1 victory point for every 5. And lastly, of course, you will score victory points for any cards you have that have victory points on them. Now, there is also a solo variant that we're going to go over for Hallertau, and the good news is you already know how to play it because the solo variant uses the exact same rules as the rest of the game, 1-to-1. There's no differences. All you're doing is that at the end when you're calculating your score, you're trying to get 100 points. If you have 100 points, it's considered that you've won. If you get 110 points, it's considered an exceptional victory. So you can try to see if you can achieve that. That's pretty much all you need to know to play Hallertau. Obviously, there are a lot of cards in this game, and part of the game is learning what each of the cards do. Thankfully, there's a really handy appendix that lists every single card in it and exactly what they do and explains them a little bit better for you. So if you have any questions about the cards, you should find your answers there. If you don't, feel free to leave a comment and I'll do my best to help you out and see if I can figure out what cards you're talking about and what the issues might be. But otherwise, that's everything you need to know how to play. I hope this video helped you out. I hope it helped you get this to the table a little bit quicker. I'm really excited about this game. I've been waiting for it for a while, so I can't wait to play it some more myself. If you like this video, consider subscribing, leaving a like, leaving a comment, leaving whatever you can to help support us. We really, really appreciate it. Otherwise, this has been another big how to play video, so I think at this point, I'm just gonna go get a drink and enjoy the rest of my day. I really, really hope I hit record.